able to identify and quantify risks and understand the applicable risk rating is an important part of the risk management process. The final risk rating is made up from the likelihood rating and overlaid against a consequence or impact rating. Here is an example likelihood table. You can see that lower ratings are assigned for the least likely occurrence. Here are a couple of example consequence tables, and you can see they are more specifically tailored for specific organisations or industries. When these two ratings are combined, the meeting point will give you the final risk rating. It is important to remember that an organisation's risk rating matrix should be tailored to the specific organisation, as should be the likelihood and consequences rating tables. Let's go through some examples to determine appropriate risk ratings. We will start with Centro Property Group, an owner and developer of retail shopping centres. This group expanded rapidly in 2006 and 2007 and funded this rapid expansion using interest-bearing borrowings. At the end of June 2006, borrowings were a little over $1.5 billion, and by the 30th of June 2007, they had increased to $3.6 billion. The value of cash and cash equivalents was only $250,000 in 2006 and $191,000 in 2007. First, let's think about the key financial risks that need to be assessed. One is liquidity risk. Could Centro make the required interest and principal payments when they fell due? A second is funding risk. Could they access additional borrowings or roll over existing borrowings when needed? Thirdly, there is interest rate risk. What impact would changing interest rates have on the interest-bearing loans? To simplify the overall analysis, let's assess funding risk in a little more detail. We're going to consider funding risk at two different points in time to illustrate why it is important to continually review and assess an organisation's risks. So for this example, we're going to consider the risk levels for Centro as at the end of the 2007 financial year, and then again in December 2007 after the onset of the global financial crisis. To determine our risk assessment, we need to look at our likelihood and consequences ratings tables. These should be tailored to suit the particular organisation. Let's first look at our likelihood table. As at the 30th of June 2007, the likelihood of Centro not being able to roll over borrowings may have been considered to have a rating of 1 or possibly 2. That is, it would have been considered rare or highly unlikely to occur given the strong support by debt providers and equity investors over the prior year or two. But by December 2007, after the onset of the global financial crisis, bank lending was severely restricted and the likelihood rating would have increased to 4 or even 5. That is, that it was very likely or almost certain that Centro would not be able to roll over borrowings. Next, we consider the consequence or severity rating. At the 30th of June 2007, this may have been rated as a 4, with a major level consequence on the organisation. Not being able to roll over borrowings would have had a significant impact on the company, possibly forcing the company to sell off assets to repay the borrowings. However, this initial severity rating suggests that the company could continue to operate. But by December 2007, this rating would have been increased to 5, as Centro's ability to sell assets without significantly reducing their values to then repay the now $4.6 billion in borrowings in the midst of the global financial crisis would have been severely restricted. This would have resulted in the company being unlikely to continue operating in its current form, hence the catastrophic rating. So now we put the likelihood rating and the consequence rating together on our risk rating matrix. And you can see that when we overlay our risk ratings, that the risk at the 30th of June 2007 was considered medium and required some review and some level of action to mitigate the risk. From an outside perspective, it appears that this did not occur at this time. And so, by the time December 2007 came along, the risk was extreme and required urgent and immediate mitigation action. Unfortunately for Centro, it was too late at this time, and this risk resulted in the collapse of the company. This example quite clearly shows the importance of ongoing reviews and how timing and changes in the external or internal environment can have a significant impact on an organisation's risk profile. In this case, if Centro had perhaps reassessed this risk in August 2007 at the very start of the global financial crisis and taken steps to mitigate it at that time, they may have been able to save themselves. Alternatively, perhaps the initial likelihood and consequence ratings could have been more conservative, leading to a higher risk rating at an even earlier point in time. Let's now look at another example, this time focusing more on consequence rather than changes in likelihood. Robotics is a medium-sized company with a $1.5 million annual sales turnover, net profits of $125,000 and net assets of $2.5 million. They've just borrowed $30,000 from the bank over 5 years on a variable rate basis, and the current interest rate is 5.50%. In this case, the two key financial risks that need to be considered are interest rate risk and liquidity risk. That is, risk exposure from changes in interest rates and risk exposure if robotics are unable to make the repayments when they fall due. Firstly, let's consider likeliness. For interest rates, the likelihood of them changing over a 5-year period is almost certain, as history shows that they change quite regularly. So the likeliness rating will be 5. For liquidity risk, the likeliness rating will be 1, as with a $1.5 million annual turnover and strong net profits, it is highly unlikely that robotics would be unable to make the required repayments, which would be around $600 per month. Next, we need to consider the consequence rating for each of the risks. For both of these risks, the consequence would be insignificant or minor, as the movement would be very small on the basis of the loan being quite small at only $30,000. So we will assign a consequence rating of 1. Putting these on our risk rating matrix, we can see that despite the likelihood for interest rate risk being almost certain, due to the consequence being insignificant, it is considered to be a medium risk, which will require at least a review and possibly risk reduction. Whereas because the likelihood and consequences are so low for liquidity risk, it is only rated low, and although it should still be monitored and included in a risk register, it does not require any extensive review or mitigation action.